now to Dr Rakib Ehsan, social policy analyst and writer. Thanks for joining us, Rakib. Well, another day, another egregious story emanating from the shambles that is Britain's migrant crisis. How on earth did this guy get asylum? His story, he arrives on the back of a lorry illegally in 2016, applies for asylum, is quite rightly rejected, applies again, is rejected, applies again, takes a bit of time out to commit a couple of sex offences. Some vicar gets hold of his case, recommends him, vouches for him, and he gets asylum. A convicted sex offender who arrived here illegally is allowed to stay. And everybody involved in that process of allowing this guy to stay should think about that poor mum and her two kids who've had their faces burnt off by this alkaline that this guy threw. That's their fault. What on earth is going on? We've got to tighten up our asylum system. We have to make it much more difficult for people to be able to stay here, don't we?
Absolutely. And Kevin, it takes a lot to surprise me when it comes to our totally dysfunctional asylum system. But this case, to be honest, I find elements of it to be absolutely astonishing. As you say, this individual entered the UK illegally on a lorry back in 2016. Twice his asylum application was rejected. Then in 2018, he was convicted of a sex offence. But what's the really interesting part of this particular case was this conversion to Christianity. And we saw this with the terrorist who was behind the bombing on Remembrance Sunday in 2021 outside Liverpool Women's Hospital.
Emad al-Swilman. Emad al-Swilman.
Indeed. So exactly. So his asylum application was also rejected twice, and he had converted to Christianity. And it was later found at the inquest that there were comments which suggested that this conversion was a deliberate attempt to strengthen his asylum claim. And then it was also later found that at his home, a prayer mat and a copy of the Quran was found, which suggests that his departure from Islam and this conversion to Christianity was not especially genuine, sincere. So I think that what we need to really talk about here is how our asylum system is being gamed by individuals. And of course, if someone is convicted of if a foreign national is convicted of a sex offence in the UK, I think that should result in automatic deportation to their country of origin, irrespective of what that country of origin may be.
Rakib, I've been looking at a lot of social media since this has happened, and the disquiet, let's call it, is palpable. People out there are now furious, not just because of this case, but what we heard on the same day about a Conservative MP having to step down because he has to wear a stab vest, and that there's been an arson attack against his constituency office by a prescribed Muslim group. And then because before this, we've seen these pro-Palestine marches, people shouting jihad. We've got a Batley teacher who is still in hiding because the elements of the Islamist community were terrorising him and bullying him for something he did in a lesson. We had a primary school in London just a couple of weeks ago, which had to close down after bomb threats because it said, please don't wear pro-Palestine badges or things like that in classrooms. People are fed up now because what they're seeing is a hardened subculture in our country essentially becoming a tail that wags the dog. And I wonder where all this is going to lead. What's your take on all of that?
Well, Alex, I authored a piece for The Telegraph yesterday where I talked about the Islamist-inspired erosion of British parliamentary democracy. Mike Freer, the MP in Finchley and Golders Green, which has a sizable Jewish population, he's an unapologetic supporter of Israel. Now, I have very different views to him when it comes to Israel-Palestine, but this is a man that's been elected by his constituents to the House of Commons on 4 consecutive occasions. Now, part of being a mature British citizen and at the heart of that social contract when living in an advanced liberal democracy is accepting a plurality of views over domestic and international issues, which are admittedly sensitive in nature. But what I'm really worried about is that when it comes to the governance of the public sphere, that democratic governance is being eroded as a result of Islamist intimidation and harassment. And I think we've seen those kind of dynamics even at schools, Alex, and I think that's deeply worrying.
Here's what worries me, Rakib, is, I think that migrants, when appropriate, should be welcomed into their country, into our country, Muslims or whoever. However, we have a problem here, and this problem is, I watched a report last night on ITV News about Mike Freer. We know what he said. I had a direct death threats from an organisation called Muslims Against Crusades. They're a proscribed terrorist organisation. Anyway, he also went on to say, and I am being victimised, I am being persecuted because I am a strong supporter of the Israel cause. He's not actually Jewish. He represents a constituency that is very Jewish. I happen to live very near there. Never once in this report did they mention the word Muslim or Islam. And that goes for politicians, that goes for people in all places. Everybody is terrified to confront the truth of this. This guy, Ezedi, was a Muslim. He wasn't a Christian. He might have pretended he converted to Christianity. And yet that is not being discussed. We've got to talk about Islam, haven't we?
Well, we've got to talk about Islamist extremism. And in many of our previous conversations, Kevin, I've been very clear that that very much remains the principal terror threat in the UK. And with going back to Mike Freer, there was an incident at a local mosque where he was visiting local Muslim constituents, where he was confronted by a group of men with one calling him a homosexual Jewish pig.
He's not even
and
Jewish.
as you've mentioned, he's a non-Jewish politician, and I think it's quite remarkable that sort of incident where he had to be relocated to a locked room for his personal safety, that could take place at a mosque. I think it's quite incredible, and I think that what's a real shame here is that we saw the Islamist terror-related killing of Sir David Emis at a constituency surgery, which is based at a church hall. And then after that, there were people talking about toxicity on social media, talking about the online harms bill, as if this was going to prevent future Islamist terrorist attacks. And I think that there's many people in the British political establishment, they need to be very clear and they need to be very honest about the threats which are presented by Islamist terrorists, but also forms of non-violent Islamism, which is eroding our British parliamentary democracy and is beginning to creep in when it comes to governance of our public sphere.
Now, Rakib, I'm going to ask you something which might be semi-difficult to answer in a country like Britain, but when you look across the channel at the sort of legislation being drawn up by countries such as France, even Emmanuel Macron, as has been suggested by Geert Wilders in the Netherlands, who got the majority in the last elections there, and actually, I think, reflective of some of the laws that exist in Muslim countries who have zero tolerance for Islamism and intolerance. Do we need to start thinking about saying there can be no more new mosques, or you cannot cover your face in public, or that we need your sermons that you're delivering inside your mosques to be monitored and we expect you to sign a treaty? Do we need to start thinking about bringing in legislation to say this isn't supposed to target the ordinary peace-abiding democratic Muslim of Britain, but we need this now because what we have is a cancer that is exponentially growing?
Well, it's interesting that you mentioned those points in terms of the full face veil, the niqab. That's been banned in particular settings in a number of Muslim majority countries based on security considerations. Now, I'm not necessarily supportive of the French model of sort of a secular Republican universalism, because I think that's actually bred a political culture which is somewhat reluctant to recognize very real forms of racial and religious discrimination. And in the piece that I authored for the Telegraph yesterday, Alex, I said that as a member of a racial, ethnic and religious minority, I'm deeply appreciative of the rights, protections and freedoms allocated under British democracy. But the key is that they're not exploited by tribal ideologues, and they shouldn't be exploited in order to dictate terms in terms of what can be said in the public sphere and how the public sphere can be organized. And I think that it's time for the British state, which, to be honest, tribal opportunists have even wormed their way into British state institutions. They need to be weeded out. They need to be removed. And it's time for our politicians and state officials to push back on creeping Islamist control when it comes to the public sphere and state-funded institutions.
Thanks, Rakib. Excellent
Thank you
stuff
so
as
much.
always. Rakib Ehsan there.